My name is Claire Bennett, and I'm 33 years old. 11 years ago, I left college in my junior year to care for my aunt after she was diagnosed with early-onset dementia at 54. My family called it, Claire finding herself a nice quiet project, the way you describe a hobby, not a decade of your life. Last month, at my cousin Vanessa's baby shower, my Aunt Patricia, the same aunt whose care I gave up my 20s for, turned to her new in-laws, gestured at me with a glass of Prosecco, and said, "And this is Claire, the poor relation. She never really found her footing after college." 20 women in pastel dresses laughed politely, the way you laugh at something you don't fully understand but sense you're supposed to find funny. I smiled and refilled the fruit tray. What none of them knew, what none of them had ever bothered to ask in 11 years, was that the trust fund paying for that baby shower, that garden, that catering bill, that entire family's comfortable life, had quietly become mine to control 9 years earlier, in a hospital room nobody else had shown up to. And in 6 weeks, the annual distribution meeting was going to make that impossible to ignore any longer. Before I tell you what happened at that meeting, if you've ever been the one who did the hardest, quietest work in your family and got called unremarkable for it, take a second and subscribe, but only if this story actually speaks to something in you. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I promise you, I see you. Let me take you back to where this all started, because you can't understand what happened in that meeting without understanding the 14 years that came before it. I grew up in Winchester, Virginia, in a family that had, 3 generations back, built a modest but genuinely successful chain of regional hardware and building supply stores called Bennett Supply. By the time I was born, my grandfather had already sold the operating business to a larger regional competitor for a considerable sum, and what remained was something my family simply called the trust, a private family trust holding the proceeds of that sale, invested conservatively for decades, that quietly funded a version of upper-middle-class comfort for 3 branches of the Bennett family without any of them, as far as I could tell growing up, ever fully understanding or questioning how it actually worked. My father, Gerald, was the middle of 3 siblings. His older sister, my Aunt Patricia, had never married and lived alone in the family's old craftsman house on Amherst Street. His younger brother, my Uncle Roy, was Vanessa's father, a genial, distractible man who ran a moderately successful landscaping company that, I'd later learn, had been bailed out by trust distributions at least 3 separate times without anyone in the family ever calling it what it was. I was the only child of my parents' marriage, which ended when I was 7, my mother moving to Richmond and slowly, over the following decade, fading out of most of my life in the particular way some parents do after a divorce. Not through any single dramatic event, just a long, quiet erosion of phone calls and visits until absence became the default. My father remarried when I was 10, to a woman named Denise who had 2 children of her own from a previous marriage, my step-siblings Kyle and Ashley, both close to my age. I want to be careful here, because this isn't a story about a wicked stepmother in any cartoonish sense. Denise wasn't cruel to me. She was simply, from the very beginning, more invested in her own children's lives than in mine, and my father, conflict-averse in the specific way some men become after a divorce they still feel guilty about, rarely pushed back on that imbalance. The result was a household where Kyle's soccer games and Ashley's dance recitals were treated as family events requiring everyone's presence, and my academic achievements, and I was, without false modesty, a genuinely excellent student, were treated as things I handled on my own, the way you handle your own laundry once you're old enough to be trusted with a machine. My cousin Vanessa, Roy's daughter, was 2 years younger than me and occupied a completely different position in the extended family's emotional economy. She was, by every family account, a Bennett through and through, a phrase I heard so often growing up that I eventually understood it to mean something specific and exclusionary, something that apparently didn't fully apply to me, the product of a marriage that hadn't survived and a mother who'd mostly disappeared. Vanessa was bright, social, effortlessly likable in the way certain people just are, and she occupied the center of every extended family gathering the way I occupied its edges. At Thanksgiving, Vanessa got asked about her college applications, her internships, her boyfriends, in loud, engaged conversations that spilled across the whole table. I got asked if I got asked anything at all. "So, Claire, how's school?" In the tone people use for questions they don't actually want a long answer to. I want to give you one memory that captures the shape of this, because I think specific details tell you more than general complaints ever can. When I was 16, I won a statewide essay competition sponsored by the Virginia Historical Society, a genuinely significant achievement that came with a small scholarship and a formal luncheon in Richmond where I was recognized alongside 11 other students from across the state. My father drove me the 2 hours to Richmond, sat through the luncheon looking mildly bored, and drove me the 2 hours home, mentioning on the drive back that he needed to leave early the next morning because Vanessa had a travel soccer tournament in Charlottesville he'd promised to attend. That same month, Vanessa's travel team made it to the regional semifinals, a fine, ordinary athletic achievement, nothing wrong with celebrating it, and my Aunt Patricia threw a family barbecue in Vanessa's honor, complete with a banner that said, "Go Vanessa," strung across the back porch of the Amherst Street house. I attended that barbecue. Nobody at it asked me a single question about Richmond.
I don't tell you this to suggest my family was monstrous. They weren't. They were something more common and more insidious than monstrous. They were people who had simply, without ever consciously deciding to, sorted the family into people worth investing attention in and people expected to manage on their own. I was very good at managing on my own. That skill, more than any other single thing, is what eventually put me in a hospital room that changed the entire trajectory of my adult life. I left for James Madison University at 18 on a partial academic scholarship supplemented by the essay competition money and a part-time job I worked throughout school because nobody had ever suggested the trust might help with my tuition, and I'd learned young enough not to ask. I studied history with a vague plan toward museum work or academia, and for the first 2 years, I genuinely loved it. The quiet, focused work of research, the particular satisfaction of building an argument out of primary sources nobody else had bothered to read closely. I was good at it, in the unglamorous, unphotographed way I'd always been good at things. Everything changed the spring of my junior year, when I got a call from my father telling me Aunt Patricia had been behaving strangely, forgetting appointments, getting lost driving routes she'd driven for decades, repeating the same stories within minutes of telling them. She was 54 years old. The diagnosis, when it finally came after months of testing, was early-onset dementia, likely Alzheimer's, though the doctors were cautious about the specific classification for the first year. Patricia had never married, had no children, and lived alone in the Amherst Street house that had belonged to my grandparents. She needed help, immediately and increasingly, and the family held one of its rare full gatherings to discuss what would happen next. I wasn't invited to that meeting. I was 20 years old, 3 hours away at school, and nobody thought to include me in a conversation about my own aunt's care, which tells you something important about how invisible I already was in this family's understanding of itself. I found out what was decided secondhand from a brief, distracted phone call from my father a few days later. My Uncle Roy, running his landscaping business, said he was too stretched to take on daily caregiving responsibilities. My father and Denise, with 2 teenagers of their own still at home, said the same. Someone, and again I never got full confirmation of who, though I have my suspicions, floated the idea that Patricia could hire professional in-home care using trust funds, which was, on paper, a completely reasonable solution. But professional care alone wasn't enough in those early years. Dementia in its early stages requires a particular kind of consistent, patient, relationship-based presence that paid caregivers, competent as they were, couldn't fully provide on their own, especially for someone as private and routine-bound as Patricia had always been. Someone needed to be there regularly, coordinating the caregivers, managing the medical appointments, providing the familiar face that kept Patricia oriented on her harder days. And in a conversation I wasn't part of, in a house I wasn't standing in, my family decided that someone should be me. My father called to present it to me not as a request, but as something already mostly settled. We were thinking, he said, in the careful, pre-negotiated tone of someone repeating a decision made by committee, that since you're not too far along in your degree yet, and history isn't exactly a program with a strict timeline, you might take a semester or 2 to help out with Aunt Patricia, just until we get a longer-term plan in place. I want to be honest with you about something. I said yes almost immediately, and not entirely because I felt pressured into it, though I did feel that pressure. I said yes because I genuinely loved my aunt. Patricia, whatever the family's blind spots about the rest of us, had always been kind to me in a quiet, understated way. She was the one relative who'd actually read my winning essay from that Richmond competition, cover to cover, and mailed me a handwritten card afterward that said, simply, "You have a mind worth taking seriously. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." I kept that card. I still have it. I took a leave of absence from JMU that fall, telling myself, the way I suspect a lot of people in these stories tell themselves, that it would be temporary. One semester became two. Two became, eventually, most of a decade, because early-onset dementia does not follow a convenient timeline, and Patricia's decline, while gradual, was steady enough that, just until we get a longer-term plan in place, never actually arrived as a distinct moment. It simply dissolved into years of me driving to Amherst Street 4, then 5, then 6 days a week, coordinating a rotating cast of professional caregivers, managing an increasingly complex medication schedule, learning to redirect her gently when she grew confused or frightened, learning to sit with her through the specific grief of watching someone forget you in stages, a little more each year, until the woman who'd once written, "You have a mind worth taking seriously," could no longer reliably remember my name on her hardest days, though she never, even in the later years, forgot that I was safe. That recognition, not of my name, but of my presence as safety, became, strangely, one of the most important things anyone had ever given me. During those years, my extended family's involvement remained almost exactly as thin as it had been from the beginning. My father visited Patricia perhaps once every 6 weeks, usually for less than an hour, usually checking his phone twice during the visit. Denise came even less often. My uncle Roy, to give him some credit, visited slightly more frequently but almost always brought Vanessa along, and their visits had a particular quality of performance to them: bright voices, quick photos for the family group chat caption things like "Sunday visit with Aunt Pat, love this woman," photos that never once in 9 years included me despite the fact that I was, on any given Sunday, the person who had actually been there every single day that week, the person who knew Patricia's current medication dosages, her triggers, her good hours and her bad ones, in a level of intimate detail none of the photographed visitors possessed or particularly wanted to possess. Vanessa, during these same years, finished her communications degree, took an entry-level job at a marketing firm in Charlottesville, started dating a man named Grant who worked in commercial real estate, and generally lived the unimpeded, forward-moving 20s I'd once imagined for myself before a phone call rerouted my entire life. I don't begrudge her that, not fundamentally. She was never taught to notice the disparity, the same way I was never taught to expect anything different. But I'd be lying if I told you there weren't nights, sitting in Patricia's darkened living room after a hard day, medication charts spread across my knees, scrolling briefly through Vanessa's social media before making myself stop, when the unfairness of it sat in my chest like something physical. Okay, let me pause the story here for a moment, because I know this section is heavy, and I want to check in with you before we keep going. If you've ever given years of your life to caring for someone your family quietly decided was your job and nobody else's, drop a comment with the word "understood." I want you to know you're not alone in this, and I want you to stay with me because the next part of this story is where things started to shift in a way I never expected. Patricia's decline, over those 9 years, followed the slow, uneven path these diseases often do, plateaus that felt almost hopeful, followed by sudden, disorienting drops. By her early 60s, she required round-the-clock professional care that I could no longer manage primarily on my own, and we transitioned her, with real grief on my part, into a well-regarded memory care facility about 20 minutes from Amherst Street, funded, appropriately, through the family trust. I continued visiting her almost every day, even after the transition, partly out of love and partly because, by that point, my entire adult identity had become so intertwined with being her caretaker that I genuinely didn't know who I was without that role. It was during one of those visits, in a quiet consultation room off the main facility floor, that everything about my life changed direction, though I didn't fully understand the magnitude of it for months afterward. Patricia's longtime attorney, a measured, careful woman named Diane Okafor who had handled the family trust's legal affairs for over 2 decades, requested a meeting with me alone, without my father or uncle present. She explained that several years earlier, back when Patricia had still possessed full legal capacity and had watched, with her characteristic quiet clarity, exactly who among her family had actually shown up for her and who had not. Patricia had executed a formal amendment to her portion of the family trust's governing documents. This amendment named me, specifically, as successor trustee for her individual trust share, effective immediately upon a formal determination of her incapacity, a determination that had, by that point, already been medically documented and legally certified for over a year, quietly, without my full understanding of its implications. I want to explain as clearly as I can what this actually meant, because the mechanics matter enormously to how this story ends. The original Bennett family trust, established by my grandfather decades earlier, had been divided, per the original governing documents, into 3 roughly equal shares upon his death, one for each of his 3 children, my father Gerald, my Aunt Patricia, and my Uncle Roy. Each sibling had significant discretion over their own share during their lifetime, including the ability to name a successor trustee of their choosing in the event of death or incapacity. My father and uncle had each, unremarkably, named their spouses and eventually their own children as their respective successors. Patricia, having no spouse and no children of her own, had named me. But here is the detail that changed everything, the detail Diane Okafor explained to me with the careful precision of someone who understood exactly how much weight it carried. Patricia's individual share of the trust, thanks to decades of conservative but disciplined investment growth, combined with the fact that she had drawn far less from it over the years than either of her siblings, Roy's repeated business bailouts, my father's periodic emergency distributions to cover Kyle's private school tuition, and Ashley's various enrichment programs, had grown to represent, by that point, nearly 42% of the entire family trust's total remaining value. More significantly still, the original trust documents contained a provision, drafted decades earlier by my grandfather with an old-fashioned but very deliberate insistence on preventing any single sibling from being financially stranded, requiring unanimous consent of all 3 sibling trustees or their duly appointed successors for any modification to the trust's overall distribution formula or investment strategy. Patricia's incapacity had not removed her voice from that unanimous consent requirement. It had simply transferred that voice to me. In practice, this meant that for 9 years during which my father and uncle continued receiving their regular annual distributions, continued treating the trust's ongoing generosity as an unquestioned birthright, continued, in Roy's case particularly, requesting periodic additional distributions to cover business shortfalls. Every single one of those decisions had required, and received, a signature from an attorney acting on my behalf as Patricia's court-recognized successor trustee, a signature I'd provided almost automatically for years, trusting Diane Okafor's professional judgment on routine matters, without ever fully grasping that the underlying authority sitting quietly behind those routine approvals was mine. I had, without realizing it, held a controlling voice over nearly half of my extended family's financial comfort for the better part of a decade, while that same family called me, at every gathering I attended, the one who never really found her footing. I want to be honest with you about how I felt learning the full scope of this, because it wasn't triumph, not at first. It was something closer to vertigo, the specific disorientation of realizing that a story you've told yourself about your own powerlessness has been, for years, factually untrue in a way nobody around you had ever bothered to explain. I sat in that consultation room with Diane Okafor for a long time after she finished explaining, turning a paper coffee cup slowly in my hands, trying to reconcile the version of myself my family had spent a decade describing with the version sitting in that chair, who had, it turned out, quietly held more actual power over their lives than any of them possessed over mine. I didn't tell my father or uncle any of this. Not out of some grand strategic plan, at least not initially, but because, frankly, nobody had ever asked. In the years that followed, I finished my degree, slowly, part-time, through a combination of online coursework and summer sessions, finally earning my history degree at 29, 6 years later than my original classmates. I took a position, modest but genuinely fulfilling, as an archivist at a regional historical society in Winchester, cataloging local records, A job that paid decently, but not spectacularly. A job my family, when they asked about it at all, treated with the same mild, distracted politeness they'd always shown my achievements. "That's nice, Claire," my father said, the one time he asked, in the exact tone he'd used about the Richmond essay competition 13 years earlier. I let him believe that job was the entirety of my financial life because by that point I'd learned something important about my family. The less they understood about what I actually had, the less they felt entitled to ask me for. Patricia passed away peacefully, in her sleep, at the memory care facility, the September I turned 32, 11 years after her diagnosis. I was, as I had been for nearly every significant moment of her decline, the family member actually present, this time not literally in the room, but the one the facility called first, the one whose name was listed as primary contact, the one who drove there at 2 a.m. to sit with her for the last hour before the funeral home arrived. My father gave a warm, generous eulogy at her funeral, describing Patricia as the heart of this family, and near the end of it, almost as an aside, the way he'd once described 9 years of my life at her own mother's funeral, he added, and of course, Claire was wonderful, being there for her all those years. Wonderful being there. 11 years, compressed into 6 words at a funeral, exactly the way it had happened once before in this family, to someone else, and now, in a strange, painful echo, to me. Here's where I need to pause again, because I know some of you are wondering what happened with the trust after Patricia's death, and I promise we're getting there. But I want you to sit with this moment first, because I think it matters. If you've ever watched your own sacrifice get summarized into a throwaway line at a funeral, comment the word "wonderful" below, with whatever tone you want to give it. I see every single one of those comments, and I want you to know this story is for you too. Now, back to the story. Under the trust's governing documents, upon Patricia's death, her individual share did not simply dissolve back into the general family pool, as I'd vaguely assumed it might. Because Patricia had never married and had no children, and because the amendment she'd executed years earlier specifically named me not just as her successor trustee during incapacity, but as the primary beneficiary of her individual trust share upon her death, a provision Diane Okafor had actually explained to me once before, in that same consultation room. Though I'd been too overwhelmed at the time to fully absorb its permanence, Patricia's entire 42% share of the family trust passed, outright and irrevocably, to me. Not as an allowance. Not as a discretionary account someone else could still influence. As mine, fully, the same way the warehouse in another family's story might have been fully someone else's, except this was considerably larger, built from decades of compounding growth on top of an already substantial base. I want to be careful here because I know how this can sound, and I don't want to misrepresent what actually happened. I did not become wealthy through some dramatic windfall I hadn't earned. I inherited what my aunt, with full clarity and full legal capacity, deliberately chose to leave to the one person who had actually shown up for her over the objections, implicit or explicit, of a family that had spent years assuming its own entitlement to that money required no corresponding presence, no corresponding care. Patricia had watched for years who visited and who didn't, who remembered her birthday and who sent a card signed by an assistant, who sat with her through her hardest, most disoriented afternoons and who scheduled brief, photographed visits designed for a group chat rather than for her. She made her decision with more clarity than most of us ever manage about anything, and she made it years before her diagnosis progressed far enough to be questioned. I didn't ask for what she left me. I simply, for 11 years, showed up. The formal reading and administration of her trust share took several months to fully process through Diane Okafor's office, quiet, procedural, entirely separate from the family's daily life. I chose, during this period, not to announce anything. I want to be honest about why. Partly, I genuinely didn't yet know how to talk about it, still adjusting privately to a version of my own life that felt entirely unfamiliar. But partly, and I've made peace with admitting this, some old, tired part of me suspected that once my family understood what I now controlled, their entire posture toward me would shift overnight, the way it had for other people in other families, in ways that would feel less like genuine reconciliation and more like a sudden, opportunistic recalculation. I wanted to see, first, without that money in the room, whether anything about how they treated me would ever change on its own. It did not. If anything, in the year following Patricia's death, my family's treatment of me settled into something even more casually diminishing than before, perhaps because the one relative who had ever seen me clearly was gone, and there was no longer even a single witness in the family capable of contradicting the story they'd all quietly agreed to tell about who I was. Vanessa got engaged to Grant that spring, and the engagement party, held at my father and Denise's house, was a lavish affair. A live band, a catered raw bar, a photo booth, funded, I noted with a private, complicated feeling, substantially through a trust distribution my uncle had requested and received just 2 months earlier, a distribution I had, without thinking much about it, approved through Diane's office as a matter of routine. I attended the party. I brought a nice gift. Nobody asked me a single question about my life the entire evening, though I was asked by no fewer than 4 separate relatives some version of the same question. So, are you seeing anyone these days, Claire? The specific, familiar concern people reserve for a woman they've quietly filed under still needs figuring out, even at 32, even after everything. 6 weeks later, Vanessa announced she was pregnant, and the family, predictably, erupted into an entirely new wave of celebration. And it was at the baby shower, held that June in my Aunt Patricia's old Amherst Street house. A detail I want you to sit with for a moment, because Patricia had left that house, too, technically, to the broader family estate rather than specifically to me, and my father had quietly claimed it as an event space for family gatherings in the 2 years since her death, never once asking whether I might have wanted to be part of that decision. That the moment happened, the one I opened the story with. The shower was full. 40 or so women spread across the backyard and wraparound porch I remembered so vividly from all those quiet years of caregiving, pastel decorations, a dessert table, the particular bright, performative energy these events always carry. I'd come straight from a long week at the Historical Society in a simple green dress and had spent most of the afternoon quietly refilling serving trays and helping the caterer, the role I'd fallen into at family events for as long as I could remember, the role of the useful, background cousin who kept things running while everyone else got to simply enjoy the party. Grant's mother, a polished, friendly woman named Carol, was making her way through the crowd being introduced to the extended Bennett family, and when she reached me, standing near the drinks table with a pitcher of lemonade in my hand, my Aunt Patricia's role in the introductions, because Patricia was gone, my aunt by marriage, Roy's wife Susan, had stepped into that particular social function. No, I need to correct myself here, because I want to tell this accurately. It was my father's second wife, Denise, technically my stepmother, who made the introduction, and she did it with the specific, careless ease of someone who has said an unkind thing about a person so many times it no longer registers as unkind at all. "And this is Claire," Denise said, gesturing toward me with her champagne glass, her voice pitched for the small cluster of women around Carol to hear. "Gerald's daughter from his first marriage. She's the poor relation, bless her. Never really found her footing after college, but she's very sweet, very helpful with things like this." She gestured, almost affectionately, at the lemonade pitcher in my hand, as though it were proof of the assessment rather than an accident of timing. Carol laughed, politely, uncertainly, the way you laugh at something that feels like it's supposed to be a joke but lands somewhere closer to discomfort. A couple of the women nearby laughed too, the easy, reflexive laugh of people who trust the speaker and don't examine the words too closely. I stood there with the lemonade pitcher, and I want to tell you honestly what I felt in that moment, because it wasn't the sharp, clarifying anger you might expect. It was older and quieter than that. It was the specific, familiar ache of a 16-year-old girl standing at a barbecue with a banner that said, "Go Vanessa," having just come home from a luncheon nobody had bothered to ask about. 11 years of caregiving. A degree finished in the margins of that caregiving. A quiet, controlling stake in nearly half the money funding the party currently unfolding around me. All of it compressed into the poor relation who never really found her footing, delivered with a champagne glass gesture toward a lemonade pitcher. I smiled. I refilled someone's glass. I did not say anything, not that afternoon, the same way I hadn't said anything at 16, the same way I'd learned, over and over, not to make my feelings someone else's problem. But something had shifted in me that I didn't fully understand until later that night, sitting alone in my apartment with a cup of tea going cold on the counter. I opened my laptop and pulled up the most recent trust documentation Diane Okafor's office had sent me, routine paperwork I'd been meaning to review for weeks and had kept deferring, the way you defer anything that requires you to fully sit with your own power. And there, in the calendar attached to the documents, I saw it. The Trust's annual distribution and governance meeting, a formal, legally required gathering of all trustees or their successors to review the prior year's distributions and approve the coming year's budget, scheduled for 6 weeks out, the second Friday of August. At Diane's office in downtown Winchester. For 9 years, I had attended that meeting the way I'd attended most things involving this family, quietly in the background, deferring almost entirely to Diane's professional recommendations, rarely asking questions, rarely exercising the full weight of the voice I actually possessed. I sat at my kitchen counter that night, tea gone fully cold, and made a decision that had nothing to do with revenge in the way you might expect, and everything to do with something I'd been avoiding for 11 years. I decided I was done attending that meeting quietly. Let me pause here again because I think this is the moment a lot of you have been waiting for, and I want to be honest about what actually happened next because it's quieter and more deliberate than you might expect. If you've ever sat through a moment of casual cruelty and smiled instead of saying anything, and then gone home and finally decided something needed to change, drop the word lemonade in the comments. I promise you, I understand exactly what that particular silence costs. Now back to the story because the next 6 weeks are the part that changed everything. I called Diane Okafor's office the following Monday and asked for a full, detailed briefing ahead of the August meeting. Not the usual quick summary, but a complete, line-by-line review of every distribution made from the trust over the previous decade, broken out by which siblings' share had funded which request. It took her office nearly 2 weeks to compile, and when the full report finally arrived, I sat with it at my kitchen table for an entire Saturday, reading it the way I imagine a historian reads a difficult primary source, carefully, without flinching, letting the facts arrange themselves into a story, regardless of whether I liked what that story revealed. The numbers told me something I'd suspected in outline, but never seen laid out in full. Over the previous decade, my Uncle Roy had requested and received 5 separate supplemental distributions beyond his regular annual share, totaling just over $310,000, each one framed at the time as a temporary business bridge loan for his landscaping company, none of which had ever been repaid to the trust. A detail the original documents technically permitted, but that Roy had clearly never intended to honor as anything other than a permanent, one-directional gift. My father, meanwhile, had drawn more modestly but more consistently, using annual distributions to cover, among other things, Kyle's private secondary school tuition for 6 consecutive years and a down payment on Ashley's first condominium, neither of which I begrudge in principle. Families help each other, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that on its face, except that during those same years, when I had once, carefully, almost apologetically, asked my father whether the trust might help cover a portion of my remaining tuition as I slowly finished my degree part-time, he told me, with what I now understood to be either genuine ignorance or convenient forgetting, that the trust doesn't really have room for extras like that right now. Honey, you understand how tight things are. Tight, apparently, had a very specific and selective definition in this family. I did not go into that August meeting planning to punish anyone. I want to be as clear about that as I possibly can because I think the distinction matters enormously, both for how this story ends and for what it might mean to those of you watching who are sitting with your own version of this exact situation. What I went in planning to do was simply, finally, exercise the actual authority I held, transparently and according to the trust's own legitimate terms, instead of continuing to quietly rubber stamp a decade of decisions I'd never fully understood, I had the power to question. The meeting was held in Diane Okafor's conference room on a bright, humid Friday morning in August, the same kind of careful, unglamorous room where I'd first learned the full scope of what Patricia had left me. My father and my Uncle Roy sat on one side of the table, both dressed slightly more formally than usual, both, I suspected, still viewing this as the same procedural formality it had always been. I sat across from them, alone, with a folder of my own notes I'd spent 2 weeks preparing. Diane opened the meeting the way she always did, reviewing the trust's overall performance for the year, and then moved, as required, into the section addressing proposed distributions for the coming 12 months. Among them, a new request from Roy for an additional supplemental distribution of $85,000 to cover what he described as a seasonal cash flow gap in the landscaping business, a request that, under the trust's unanimous consent requirement, needed my formal approval as Patricia's successor and, now, primary heir to her controlling share. I asked, calmly, for the first time in 9 years of attending these meetings, to actually review the detailed financial documentation supporting that request before approving it. I watched my uncle's easy, confident posture shift, almost imperceptibly, into something more careful. "It's just the usual paperwork, Claire," he said, with a small, slightly strained laugh. "Diane's seen it all before, it's fine." I told him, as evenly as I could manage, that I was sure it was, but that I'd like to see it myself, given that my signature was the one actually required to approve it. There was a long silence in that conference room, the kind where you can feel several people simultaneously recalculating something they'd never previously thought required calculation. My father spoke next, his voice carrying the same easy, dismissive warmth he'd always used with me, the tone that had followed me from a spelling, no, from a Richmond luncheon, all the way to this conference room. "Claire, honey, this is all pretty standard stuff. You don't need to worry yourself with the details. That's what Diane's here for. And I want you to understand, this is the moment where something in me that had been quiet for 11 years finally, calmly, found its voice." I told him, without raising my voice, without any theatrical flourish, that I appreciated his confidence in Diane's work, but that as the person whose signature the trust's own governing documents required for this exact decision, I intended to actually exercise the judgment that authority implied, the same judgment. I noted that Aunt Patricia had trusted me with specifically because she'd watched for years who actually showed up and who didn't. I watched my father's face do something I'd never seen it do before, a kind of slow, visible recalibration, the same one I'd later learned Thomas Whitfield experienced in an entirely different family story, the moment someone finally understands that the person they've spent years underestimating has been standing, quietly, at the center of the room the entire time. "Wait," he said slowly. This is your approval that's actually required? Not just a formality." And Diane Okafor, with the careful, patient precision of a woman who had been waiting years for this exact question to finally get asked out loud, explained, clearly and without any editorializing, the full structure of Patricia's amendment, the 42% share, the unanimous consent requirement, the fact that every distribution either of them had received over the previous decade had technically required, and received, sign-off from an authority that had, for the past 2 years, belonged entirely to me. I want to pause here, because I know this is the moment you've been waiting for, and I want to describe it honestly rather than dramatically, because the truth of that room was quieter and stranger than anything scripted. Nobody shouted. Nobody stood up. My Uncle Roy, to his credit, went very pale and very quiet, the particular quiet of a man doing math he didn't want to be doing. My father asked, in a voice smaller than I'd heard from him in years, "Did you know about this?" At Vanessa's shower, when Denise said, and he stopped himself, unable to finish the sentence, which told me everything about how completely he'd forgotten his own wife's words within the space of a single conversation, the way this family had always been able to forget things that were inconvenient to remember. I told him, honestly, that yes, I had known for 2 years, and that I hadn't said anything because, frankly, nobody had ever asked. I told him I wasn't there that day to punish anyone or to withhold anything out of spite, that Roy's request, on its actual merits, reviewed properly, appeared reasonable enough that I intended to approve a modified version of it, with a repayment structure attached this time, something the trust's documents had always technically allowed but that nobody had ever bothered to require. What I told him I would no longer do, going forward, was approve anything automatically, without review, the way I had for 9 quiet years while being told, at every family gathering in between, that I was the one who hadn't found her footing. The room sat with that for a long moment. And then, in a detail I still think about often, my Uncle Roy, staring down at the table, said quietly, almost to himself. Patricia knew. She must have known for years that we weren't. And he didn't finish that sentence either, but he didn't need to. Diane, watching all three of us with the careful neutrality of someone who has seen a great many families reckon with exactly this kind of moment, simply nodded once and let the silence do the rest of the explaining. Let me pause the story one final time here because I know some of you are wondering how the rest of the family found out, since this meeting happened quietly, in a conference room, away from any audience. And the truth is, the way it spread wasn't dramatic at all. It was my father, 2 days later, sitting Denise and Vanessa down separately, unable to hold the full weight of what he'd learned without telling someone. The way secrets that reshape your understanding of your own family rarely stay contained for long. If you've ever watched the truth ripple out slowly through a family instead of exploding all at once, comment "slow ripple" below, because I think that's actually closer to how most real reckonings happen than the dramatic version we're used to seeing. In the weeks that followed, the family's response unfolded in a way that surprised me less than I expected it to, given everything I'd learned about how people in this family tend to process discomfort. Denise, when my father finally told her, apparently focused less on any genuine reflection about her own comments and more on a kind of anxious, performative backpedaling. She called me, about a week later, her voice bright and strange in a familiar way, to tell me how wonderful it was that I'd done so well for myself, a phrasing that managed, somehow, to still position my life as an unexpected surprise rather than the direct, earned outcome of 11 years of sacrifice she'd witnessed and dismissed the entire time. I told her, as gently as I could manage, that I appreciated the call, but that I remembered exactly what she'd said at the shower, and that I'd need more than one phone call to feel comfortable with how she talked about me going forward. She hasn't repeated that particular comment since, though I understand from Vanessa that she's mentioned to several friends how proud she's always been of me, a version of events I've decided isn't worth the energy it would take to correct. My Uncle Roy handled it with more genuine humility than I expected from him, which I want to give him real credit for. He came to my apartment, alone, about 3 weeks after that meeting, and sat at my small kitchen table looking, for the first time in my life, genuinely uncertain of himself. "I don't have a good excuse," he said, turning a coffee mug slowly the way I would later hear another man, in another family's version of this exact reckoning, turn his own coffee cup in an Ohio diner. I think I told myself for years that the business bailouts were temporary, that I'd pay it back eventually, and somewhere along the way I stopped actually believing that and started just believing I was entitled to it. And I never once thought about what that money not being available might have meant for you, back when you were the one who actually needed it. It wasn't a perfect apology. It didn't undo a decade of imbalance in one kitchen table conversation. But it was honest in a way I hadn't expected, and I found that I could accept it as a genuine starting point, even if I wasn't ready to fully trust what came after it. My father's reckoning took longer and remains, if I'm honest, incomplete in ways I've made peace with rather than resolved. He apologized, eventually, for the Richmond luncheon, for Denise's comment at the shower, which he called unkind and completely out of line, and for what he described as years of not paying close enough attention. But I noticed in the months that followed that his apologies tended to arrive clustered around moments when he needed something from me, a signature, a clarification about trust procedures, an update on a distribution timeline, and I've had to hold two things at once, the way I imagine a lot of you watching this have had to hold two things at once about your own families. That his apology was probably sincere in the moment he gave it, and that sincerity in a moment doesn't automatically translate into a fully reshaped pattern. I've decided that's all right. I don't need him to fully transform. I've simply stopped needing his understanding to feel certain of my own worth. Vanessa, of everyone, surprised me the most, the same way I've since learned surprising, unexpected redemptions tend to come from the people you'd least predicted. She called me a few weeks after the baby was born, a healthy girl named Iris, and asked, hesitantly, if I'd be willing to come by and meet her. "I've been thinking a lot," she said, "about how much of my whole life happened because you were quietly holding things together in the background at Aunt Patricia's, and I never once said thank you because I never once really saw it. I don't know how to fix 11 years of not seeing you, Claire. but I'd like to start trying if you'll let me. I did let her. I've held that baby, now 9 months old, more times than I expected to, and Vanessa, to her genuine credit, has become someone who asks real questions about my life now and actually waits for the full answer, instead of the 30-second version she used to accept before changing the subject back to herself. I want to tell you honestly what I did with the trust itself, because I think it matters more than the confrontation did. I did not restructure the distribution formula out of spite, and I never once considered withholding support from family members who genuinely needed it. What I did instead, working closely with Diane Okafor, was implement something the Trust's original documents had always technically allowed but nobody had ever bothered to require: a simple, transparent annual review process, applied equally to every branch of the family, with clear documentation and modest repayment structures for anything beyond the standard annual distribution. It wasn't punitive. It was simply the kind of basic accountability that should have existed from the beginning, the kind Patricia herself, watching quietly for years before her diagnosis progressed too far to act on what she'd observed, had clearly decided was overdue. I still work at the Historical Society in Winchester, cataloging local records, a job I love regardless of what sits in my trust account, because I learned, somewhere in those 11 years of caregiving, that meaningful work and financial comfort don't have to be the same thing, and that I'm allowed to want both without apologizing for either. I kept Patricia's handwritten card, the one that said, "You have a mind worth taking seriously," framed now on my office wall, next to a small brass plaque the Historical Society gave me last year for 10 years of service, a decade that, on paper, looks like a straightforward career timeline, but that I know, and now my family knows too, was actually built entirely in the margins of something much harder and much more invisible. If you take one thing from this story, let it be this: the people who decide, early and often, that you are the one who never found her footing are rarely making an honest assessment of your worth. They are usually, whether they realize it or not, describing how little effort your quiet reliability required from them, and mistaking that ease for evidence about who you actually are. I spent 11 years being underestimated by a family who benefited, directly and substantially, from exactly the qualities they dismissed in me: my patience, my consistency, my willingness to show up without needing applause for it. What I learned, eventually, is that those qualities were never actually a weakness waiting to be corrected. They were the entire foundation the rest of their comfortable lives had been quietly built on top of, whether they ever chose to see that or not. You don't need a trust fund or a conference room reveal to prove your worth to people who've already decided not to see it clearly. Sometimes the truest kind of justice, if you want to call it that, isn't about the moment the truth finally comes out. It's about the 11 years before that moment, when you kept showing up, kept doing the work, kept being decent, long before anyone was paying close enough attention to notice, because that, and not the reveal, is where your actual worth was built the entire time. Thank you for staying with me through this one. If any part of this reminded you of your own family, your own quiet years of showing up while somebody else got the banner and the barbecue, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, about invisible labor, about patient boundaries, about the specific, quiet kind of justice that doesn't need an audience to be real, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and I'll see you in the next one.